and I was out in the world and I was writing, but I didn't know what I was writing or if it was real or what was really going on with my writing. And I decided that I should do something to see if this poetry thing was real. So I found a workshop to attend, and it was in Iowa, and most of you know that I come from California. So Iowa was this foreign land, and I had no idea what it would be like, but they had poetry there, and they still do. So I went to a week-long conference, and it was the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, which sounds really fun, and it was fantastic. But I signed up for a poetry workshop, and Max Garland was my instructor. And it was an amazing week of writing and of being in the Midwest, and there were fireflies and just all of these wonders that I had never really experienced. But part of our workshop was a one-on-one critique, which at the beginning of the week sounded terrifying, and by the end of the week I was really excited about it. But one of the things that Max Garland shared with me, and it's this piece of advice that I still hear in my head when I write, and I've tried to share it with my students. And he looked at my poems and he said, "These are good, but you need to make some room for the reader. You need to make a space for the reader in your poems." And for some reason, up until that point, it had never occurred to me that there would be a reader, or that they would need room. So this changed how I was writing, and it's stayed with me. So there were a couple of things I picked up from this experience. That piece of advice was one of them, and changed my writing. The idea of being in the Midwest was huge for me, because I had decided then that I was going to apply to grad programs, and a lot of them were located in the Midwest. So that was a nice experience too. But Max Garland was also the first poet that I met that was a person, like a living, alive person who had had other jobs, who had worked, and that was huge for me too, because he was real, like a real person could do this, so that meant I could do this. He was also the first poet that I'd ever met that was from Kentucky. And this was a big deal for me, because the second poet that I ever met from Kentucky, I married. So
I missed it like that.
it is my great pleasure to introduce Max Garland today. He has a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Iowa. He's the author of several chapbooks and 2 books of poetry: Hunger Wide as Heaven, which won the Cleveland State University Poetry Center Open Competition, and The Postal Confessions, which won the Juniper Prize for Poetry. In addition, his work has garnered numerous other awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Poetry Fellowship, a Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing Poetry Fellowship, and 2 Wisconsin Arts Boards Literary Fellowships. He was also named the 2013-14 Wisconsin Poet Laureate by the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters. And the Poet Laureate Commission described his work as having rich language, possessing human understanding, and being accessible for broad audiences. He has been teaching since 1990. He's currently a full professor of English and creative writing at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. Okay? And this is something interesting I found. He was asked after it was announced that he was going to be the Poet Laureate, "Why did you decide to write poems for a living?" Which I always think is an interesting question. And part of his response is that what appeals to me about poetry, that it allows for individual expression, and yet through imagery, metaphor, music, and intuitive extension, it allows us to connect to others, living and dead, and possibly yet to be born. And a good poem is never obsolete. Also, poetry at its best breeds empathy, and we need more of that. Please welcome Max Garland.
you'd be surprised at how many people I've met who have married the next person they met afterwards. I don't know what it is. It's just my fate. So after you meet me, if you want to meet me, just be ready, because you're probably going to get married soon to someone else. Thanks for coming. It's a kind of typical day, late fall day. Yesterday was so beautiful. I took my first creative writing class in this school many years ago when I was still a rural mail carrier in western Kentucky, which I did for about 10 years. I was a rural mail carrier. When I wrote much of this first book on the route where I was born, my parents lived there, my grandfather had run it, and so I tell people when they said, well, how did you get from being a rural mail carrier in Kentucky to being the poet laureate of Wisconsin? And I tell them that, well, you start down on the old Cairo Road, box 1, and then you go a few boxes down and you keep going and deliver all the mail, and then just cross the river, head up through Illinois, and one day just don't keep going into Wisconsin, and the mail that you deliver is just different kind of mail, The addresses are different. The subject matter is different, but I still think of it in a similar way. There are these bits of language that we want to deliver to other people, and so in other words, I still think I'm a mail carrier. It's just different kind of mail. I also, my heart and soul still belong here. I went back to college when I was 35 years old, to graduate school, so I still, even though my accent is kind of been altered, when I get very tired, or if I'm here a few more days, it will come back. The eyes will devolve back into eyes, and I will be myself again. I think the main thing, if there was going to be a theme to this, it would be that though I didn't think there was any poetry in my background, much later in life I realized that poetry had been all around me the whole time I was growing up. And I'll give you an example. We went to Methodist churches when I was growing up, and Baptist churches mostly. The Methodist churches I went to in Paducah were more tolerant, but the Baptist churches had better singing, so it was kind of a balance. And my uncle was a Pentecostal minister. We didn't go to his church often, but since he was my uncle, we did go there. That church is still here. He's gone. And much, much later, I realized that even though we had no books of poetry, poetry was coming at me as I sat in those pews, as I held those hymn books, as I listened to the radio. I wouldn't have called it poetry, but it was. And so this is a poem about my uncle, and he was a Pentecostal minister here in Paducah at Gospel Assembly Church. He drove a Lincoln Continental, which he liked his cars. The fact that he was a spiritual man did not rule out having a car as wide as this room. And this is a poem for him. It's called Memories of Pentecost, and I think it's about my first poetry lesson. I had an uncle who healed by faith and drove a Lincoln. Smack in the middle of the forehead with the palm of his hand, and the eyes wobbled in their sockets. Sound like a ribbon unfurled from the tongue. It might have been Hebrew, it might have been Chickasaw, it may have had something to do with marrying cousins. Who's to say? It wasn't the blow of grace itself, the organist beating the hymn like a bad child, the ceiling fan spinning as if the roof might fly away, and even if the Spirit missed me by an eyelash, a whisker, a country mile, even if Sunday after Sunday I dodged the white arrow that pierced the true apostles, it was enough to know it was somewhere in the family, somewhere in my uncle, flapping like a wild bird in his chest as he touched them, as he let them go, the organ swooping down like a train at a crossing as he danced his little dance, one step, and then a wiggle, sweet Jesus, sweet jangle, the keys to the Lincoln alive in his pocket. The reason I think that was my first poetry lesson is because without knowing it, I was learning that language, which you could look at, it was vowels and consonants, was conveying invisible, old truths or feelings or emotions, that it was conveying things that were of ultimate importance, even though it was ordinary words with sort of musical cadences. So I guess that's one of the things about poetry. Whenever I hear people think, well, poetry is okay, but it's difficult or it's obscure, it's not something that I've ever felt comfortable with. I had a terrible person for a teacher in the 10th grade and I swore off poetry or something. I always think of all of that time it's flooding words, and some of which you recognize as being a little truer or deeper than ordinary are coming at you. It also sometimes is trying to tell us things that we don't actually know it's trying to tell us. This is another poem. It doesn't seem like it's about Paducah. As a matter of fact, I wrote it in Iowa, and I began to think of it while I was watching a poetry reading as I was in graduate school. I was listening, and the poetry readings at the University of Iowa used to be in the physics building. And behind the people who were reading was a giant poster of the periodic chart of the elements. And so when I would get bored at a reading, let me see. No, there's not much to look at behind me, but when I got bored at a reading, I would read the periodic chart of the elements. And so I started thinking, I was sitting there and said, I'm going to write a poem about all of those elements. And so this is how far I got. Hydrogen. That's it. That's all I got. It's number one, the tiniest element. And so the point I'm trying to make is, I thought, I'm going to write a poem and I'm going to try to make something of the very tiniest element in the universe. And the technique of this poem, if any of you are interested in writing, is I put the title hydrogen down and then I wrote down everything I could think of about hydrogen that I knew. That's it. I will tell you after the poem what I think it's really about. But this is the poem, Hydrogen. A balloon, a bomb, a drop of water, the skin around the sun burning outward. You are truly next to nothing, and yet everywhere, so neighborly, so eager to combine. When oxygen decided to swim, you only ask how far. When tears needed a catalyst, you solemnly stepped forth. In every cell, plant, or animal, it's just not the same without you. It's not the same ocean or body, it's not the rain or snow. And still, such a vulnerable element. Just a proton huddled under the wavering attentions of a lone electron. A body composed mainly of the distance between you. A fragile marriage which, if it ends, may end badly. And your loss breed a loneliness so deep, as tiny as you are, the whole world withdraws in consolation. Now, it could be, since it occurred to me that breaking apart the tiniest thing in the universe could end all life on Earth, I got so depressed I didn't want to write about the rest of the elements. But years later, after that poem was published, it was even in a physics journal and everything, and I realized I wouldn't have written that poem had I not been from Paducah, had I not been a baby boomer, had I not grown up and gone to school at Concord Elementary School, and when the sirens went off, ducked under my desk, because we all knew, if you're of that generation, the world will be annihilated. Everyone you love will be ground to dust, but you will be protected by that desk should the Russians bomb us. And so that was embedded in my memory when I said my prayers at night. If I should die before I wake, if you were of my generation, you thought that could happen. You know, those bombs are pointed at us. If you lived through 1962, the 10 days of the Russian Missile Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, you thought, well, it could all end at any moment. So I have a feeling I picked hydrogen because of that, but there's one further reason. I think I picked it because the largest employer in Paducah was Union Carbide, the gaseous diffusion plant where they refined uranium. I knew that planes couldn't fly over there. We bragged to each other in grade school that we were high on the Russians' target list. It was a weird kind of pride that they would bomb us before they would bomb New York. But so this whole idea that your fate, oddly enough, was bound up in this tiny, tiny particle, hydrogen. It took me years after I wrote that poem to know that it was autobiographical. It was about the way I grew up, the way I thought the world would end, the thing that I thought was hovering over me, even though I thought it was an exercise to just keep my mind occupied while I was listening to a reading. By the way, you're welcome to actually let your mind wander. All the Sundays I sat in church, I used to feel guilty because I would be thinking of dinner afterwards, or I wanted to out of church, and you know, I thought that was bad, that was sinful. And later I started thinking, no, that was like the best part of church, where your mind wandered. And so I'm inviting you to do that. I'll read another poem that's from Paducah. This is about being king of the 5th grade at Concord Elementary School. I'm not just bragging that I was king of the 5th grade. It's true, I was, but every year a different person, a different boy was elected king of each grade. So by the 5th grade, there were only like 2 or 3 of us left who had not yet been king. And so I got to be king of the 5th grade, and I hope they still don't do this in elementary school, but they would march the king and queen of each grade down in the middle of the basketball game, and I had on a cardboard crown covered with aluminum foil. The queen was all decked out and flowery and everything, and that's fine, but I was about 4'2", and the queen was like a full-grown woman. And so she could have carried me down the aisle, is what I'm saying. And so I wrote my girlfriend in graduate school left me a handful of daffodils. And so the way the poem worked in my mind was, these daffodils remind me of spring in Kentucky. That reminds me of one spring night when I got all dressed up and escorted this lovely girl down the runway and tried to act kingly. So that was the conscious part. Later, after I got finished with the poem, I realized, oh, but it's also kind of a comment upon the roles that we're given. This is the male, you're the king. This is the female, you're flowery and lovely, and how absurd that is when you're just a pipsqueak and, you know, trying to act kingly. And so it was about gender roles. And it's funny how I still discover things about the poem as I go on. But anyway, this is it. This is actually her name. I don't know where she is, but she could be here. Yeah, because you left me a handful of daffodils, I suddenly thought of Brenda Hatfield, queen of the 5th grade. A very thin, shy girl, almost as tall as Audrey Hepburn, but blonde. She wore a dress based upon the principle of the daffodil. Puffed sleeves, inflated bodice, profusion of frills along the shoulder blades and hemline. A dress based upon the principle of girl as flower. Everything unfolding, spilling, outward and downward, ribbon, stole, corsage, sash. It was the only thing I was ever elected, a very short king. I wore a bow tie and felt like a 3rd grader. Even the scent of the daffodils you left reminds me. It was a spring night, and escorting her down the runway was a losing battle, trying to march down among the full, thick folds of crinoline, into the barrage of her father's flash bulbs, wading the backwash of her mother's perfume, scared, smiling, tiny, down at the end of that long, thin Audrey Hepburn arm where I was king. It took me many years to realize that was about the relationship I was in when I wrote the poem, not Brenda Hatfield. So, I guess the point is, poetry, unlike the persuasive essay, sometimes is making an argument that you don't know it's making. You know, if you're really being honest, you're saying, for some reason, I remember this night. Did you hang? Well, I have a picture of it, but it haunts me. I want to write some. I want to recapture it. And yet the reason that you recapture it is not always the reason that you're conscious of. It haunts you for a different reason. I'm going to read a poem now. I might have this memorized, I don't know, but I'm going to read it anyway. It's about losing your accent. The main difference from the way I spoke when I grew up and the way I speak now is the difference between I and I. I used to say I. Now most of the time I say I. It's not a proper Wisconsin accent. That's not a very pretty accent either. But I think about that. In order to go where you need to go, in order to do what you think maybe, possibly you were born to do, sometimes you have to go so far away that you sort of lose track of where you came from. In other words, there's a price to pay. And I think this losing my accent for me is very fraught. I didn't set out to do it, but it kind of got carved away. And this is about your allegiance to who you loved, where you came from, and your allegiance to who you are. An oral history of the English language. I'm glad my sister was thinking of coming. She didn't come, so I feel more comfortable reading this because her name is in here. An oral history of the English language. Sometimes I wake up with my hillbilly voice. I don't know why. Maybe a dream took me back. The catalpas wilting in the heat, the dust devils walking the dry field. Maybe the river was trying to shine through the silt and accumulated years. But when my head cleared and sleep ended, there was only the twang of home left over, like stubble in a milo field. Sometimes I wake with the voice of my mother, every syllable stretched like sorghum or cold honey, the vowels washing over the consonants without mercy. Every word elongated, drenched in deliberation. The name of my sister, for instance, Pam, becomes Pam. Takes two syllables, one to release the word, the other to call her back again. Or sometimes I wake with my schooled tongue, the tongue that moved away, all the I's and Y's precisely spoken, buttoned in their uniforms, the cap brims set at the proper angles of ambition, a voice clipped and regulated, rising and falling like the boots of a mercenary, drawn deeper and deeper into the provinces, hunting the stragglers of childhood down. When I first wrote this poem, I used to have to explain to very young people what fedoras were. Now all my students wear fedoras, male and female. This is a poem about the same subject, about how, ironically, when you discover that in order to discover who you are, in order to inhabit your own name and your own self, you also discover that you're separate from those that you come from, those people who brought you into the world. And that maybe love is the negotiation of that distance from that self back to where you came from. Fedoras. They come out of the 1940s to be your parents. Their faces swim and settle into clarity, the crook of an arm, the fount of a breast. They come from the time before your life, before the things that filled your life, before water sprang from the faucet, before television loomed in the corner and even the house cats gathered to watch. They come from after the war, when all the movies were jubilant, even the sad ones bloodless. It's as if you were handed down to them, as if you were a pearl they would polish into life. From times of great difficulty, they come, though speaking with a deep nostalgia, lowering the language to you like a ladder, rung by rung. Before you existed, they are, which is like something out of the Bible. Out of their own childhoods they come, to be stricken with this, to be stricken with time, of which you are the immediate symptom. Bringing their jewelry and shaving brushes, wearing their fedoras and hairdos, they come to be your parents. You have your father's eyes, someone says. But no, you have your mother's face and eyes, is the more common opinion. They send you wobbling out like a top in front of them. The wind could almost bowl you over. You turn back, and they are dressed like characters in a movie or a dream. You turn back, and this is love. Your own name sinks in and separates you. My father grew up near Granville, where we went yesterday, the thriving metropolis of Granville, Kentucky. My grandfather had a farm out there, a little farm, and I used to climb up in the barn. And religion for me, the Baptist, the Methodist, the Pentecostal, I thought that was pretty much the choice that you had in the world. But I used to turn over things, you know, everything. The only 3 books I remember as a child in our home was a kind of big, thick cookbook that was addressed to Mrs. Homemaker, a Western, a paperback Western or 2 by Max Brand, in which there was always a loner, tough guy, didn't say much, came into town, didn't cause trouble, but if you caused trouble with him, you know, he meant business. There were racy parts in my dad, you know, I would read them on the sly, and the racy part consisted of this. There would be a woman, the word bosom would appear. Very racy. And then the other book was the King James Bible, which my grandmother gave me when I was 7. I also didn't know that was my first book of poetry. I mean, I knew Psalms were like songs, and I knew that the Song of Solomon was supposed to be a poem. I knew Ecclesiastes sort of sounded like musical in some ways, but I would turn these things over, you know, and I think children, they will pretend to go along, but they're really trying to figure out, okay, but there's this I'm being taught, and there's this I'm seeing, and this I'm told is right, and this I'm told is wrong. And so this is a poem about trying to figure out, okay, as about a 7-year-old, the difference between good and evil. And I'll just tell you the end of this, I didn't figure it out. It's called A Barn Near the Granville Fork. When I was 7, I'd climb into the loft where I could be invisible like the Methodist Jesus, a benign watcher of the farm. A quarrel of crows flapped into the locusts bordering the field. Herefords navigated the rye. Imitating the circle of the pond, swallows lured the insects up, while just below, pullets scratched a living from the hoof prints of the great sow, twitching in her wrapper of gnats. Then the row of empty stalls, then the filled crib where the corn snake grew larger by the year. A presence we could have ended but didn't, and therefore twisted evil to our advantage, I was taught. Although I debated the point as I sat in the loft, a fleck of hay wandered into the sun. My dull sister, the calf, stood in the muck near the trough, and I wondered whose side it was right to be on. The corn snake, coiled into a thick rope of patience, waiting as still as the grain, or the field rat I knew would eventually scamper from his nest of stale straw behind the rusted harrow, the little creature whose name was filth but whose flaw was genuine hunger, for which he stole the corn and died. One more churchy sort of poem. When I was a child, you could tell the economic status of the family by the church they went to. The richest people went to the Episcopal Church. And so this is a poem about passing by the, and also in the late 50s, you could tell the spiritual status of a person by the size of the car they drove, of course. So this is called Requiem for a Boomtown. How many people here actually grew up in Paducah in the 50s or near here? Anyone else? What? I didn't know that it was a boom town. I thought it was just a very thriving town, but since the atomic plant opened, just thousands and thousands of people had just moved to town. And so it was just thriving. Downtown Paducah was just clogged with traffic. And it was also, you know, cars with tail fins as long as the actual cars we have now. And this was about, as a child, thinking about that, trying to see like what you were supposed to believe when you were in the church, but then what you saw when you stepped out into the bright sunlight of the parking lot. It's called Requiem for a Boomtown. It was Sunday, 1957, and the parking lot of the Episcopal Church was the best time a tail fin ever had. The sunlight fractured itself, car after car, each one sleeker than the one before. Cars the size of small living rooms, each one more radiant. As if the families merely waited in the church, killing time, while the real worship was parked in the lot. Was the sun on the grillwork or shapely along the fenders, or in the names of the animals emblazoned above the trunk latches. The real worship was in the sound of the car door closing, heavy as a vault, the settling in, and that moment of silence just before he turned her over and felt himself, the wife, the son, the daughter, lifted in the glittering wave of all a man could ever want. I also wouldn't mind a question or two before my time is on earth is gone, or even to here today. If anyone has a comment or question, I mean, I think I'll read one more poem, and then I'll sort of ask if anyone has any comment or question, and then just I'll say something very brief, and then I'll read another poem or two, maybe at the end. But I did work as a postal carrier here. So this is the poem is called Postal Confessions. It's really for anyone who ever has a job that they think maybe is not what they intended, and maybe even someone who has a life that they think maybe is far from what they intended. It's for anyone who's ever stood down on the banks of the Ohio River and looked across at the other side, which after all is only southern Illinois, but still, sometimes it looks like maybe where you should be. It's for anyone like me who is afflicted by that strain. I think maybe this was drummed into me through all those hymns I grew up with. The other side of the river, you know, milk and honey, that sort of thing. The Postal Confessions. Do you have any former postal employees here? Okay. Just want to make sure there weren't any disgruntled postal workers here. The Postal Confessions. The sorting machine whirs like the blades of a fan. You could fall asleep if it weren't for the money, if it weren't for the fact that the work is already much deeper than sleep. And what could you fall into lower than life you never intended, yet inhabit, like the rumble in the conveyor's constant moan? The strange thing is hardly anyone writes anymore, yet the tonnage builds and builds. Hardly anyone spills even a grain of his life in a letter. Yet the machines whir and jam, the bundles threaten to topple, the mail cases bulge with billing and the inky brightness of sales pitch. You could fall asleep if it weren't for the third cup of vending machine coffee, which resembles in color, texture, and taste the silted waters of the Ohio in spring, which is why they built the town in the first place, to drink the waters of the river, to burden the long twisted back of the river with bridges and barges, to sit in the slump of afternoon watching the sun float down from white to yellow to red to maroon, the last few gulls raking the far shore as if even the shadows were richer there. Okay, now I'm going to pause briefly, see if anyone in this illustrious audience has a question, a writing question, or any comment at all. And then, if not, I'll go on. Or I might just make up an answer as if you'd ask a question, and then I'll read it like a couple more poems later, something along those lines. How many people here have not been to a poetry reading before? Nobody? Two? Okay, yeah. I don't think I ever did until I was 28. Pretty old person. I think, okay, but, oh yeah, questions. Anyone have a question?
Do you have any advice for someone struggling with line breaks?
Boy, that's a very specific. Do I have any advice for someone struggling with line breaks? I guess that's one of the things that you learn about poetry, that it's lined up often like that. And so you have to figure out. The line breaks in some, they're supposed to give you a clue in case you don't have the live poet there with you, like when you're supposed to pause, or, they're supposed to keep you from racing through the poem too quickly, because if you're writing a poem in which you go from one emotion to another emotion, or you go from the past to the future, you want to try to slow people down. So sometimes you shorten the lines, you put stanza breaks, and you're hoping that people pause and they think, they mull these things over, because the language in a poem is often thicker, it's often more concentrated, and so sometimes it bears a little more time, and sometimes the poet wants you to spend more time there. And so those are that. So usually advice is, if you think you want someone to pause, you might end the line there. But if you do that every time, it's going to sound mechanical. So you have to do some variation of putting a period and a strong word at the end of the line, but then once in a while having that line just flow on. And so it sounds like, oh, I'm seeing a pattern. Like these poems I've been reading, none of them really rhyme. Some of them had internal rhyme. I'm not saying they have eternal rhyme. But they have alliteration, they have certain repeated syllables, and they have a rhythm to it. And that's what the line breaks, I think, are trying to do. They're trying to give you a sense of how it's supposed to sound. When I was studying poetry as a student in school, I didn't know that poetry belonged out in the air. I thought it was on a page. I didn't know that you were supposed to say it. And so I wrote all kinds of things that they looked okay on the page, but they couldn't possibly have been uttered by a kid growing up in Western Kentucky who was working on them. I mean, they were antique language. They weren't like me at all. And when I first realized that, oh, a poem can sort of be based upon or drawn from the way you actually speak in the world, that can be a poem too. Because the way you speak in the world, and we all know people who to a greater or lesser extent do this, has rhythm to it. We know some people who are more articulate, colorful in their language. We know some people who aren't. And that poetry to me can be built upon the speaking voice to some extent. And I think line breaks are supposed to give you a clue as to that. Through most of human history, poems weren't written down at all, obviously. A poet was supposed to have tens of thousands of lines of poetry memorized. And the library was in the poet's head. Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, those were memorized. And these things we talk of as techniques, rhyme, alliteration, repeated patterns, those are all ways that people figured out to keep tens of thousands of lines in their heads as they went through life. Because no one, even if they had been able to write them down, the people out there wouldn't have been able to read them through most of human history. When the printing press and when books became more prominent, then spoken word, the spoken voice kind of, to some extent, disappeared from poetry. Now that a lot of younger people particularly are into spoken word and slam and even hip hop and rap, that's been going on for a long time. At least we now know that poetry can be spoken and that it can also be on a page, so I think that's an advantage that I didn't have. And that's about all I have to say about line breaks. Yes.
Can you say more about the poetry scene among young people? I was invited to a poetry reading by a contemporary, and he was the oldest person there, and the only person who read from a script. The rest of it was the slang stuff, and I just wanted what your reaction is.
Yeah, she's saying she went to a reading and there was one older person there, and he was the only person who read, and the rest spoke the poems. And yeah, I mean, this comes from the media. I mean, these things are available on YouTube and other places. And I think that there are a lot of kids who feel like they don't have a chance to say what they think or say who they are within the confines of the regular assignments and classrooms and other things. And so some kids find a great outlet. You know, they feel like maybe the other outlets that are more formal are not allowing them to express themselves, and that has become an outlet. So I think it's good. I think it's very good, and I think it makes some of us who grew up with Norton anthologies, you know, and writing for the page and rewriting everything 40 times, which I did, most of the poems in this book, you know, feeling like, well, yeah, but that's just simple. If you read it on a page, it's not going to amount to much. And that's one way to think about it, but it seems like the world of poetry, like the world of music, can contain both of those things, you know? I like bluegrass music. I play it. That doesn't mean I don't appreciate classical music or find it brilliant. So to me, usually when you hear somebody coming down on formal academic poetry or spoken word or open mic kind of poetry, they're usually doing it because they feel threatened in some way. And I just don't feel threatened by those things. As a matter of fact, I've memorized more of my poems as a result of reading at open mics with kids who have memorized long things. And I'm starting to think, well, they can memorize that. I'm supposed to be the poet. Why? And here I am leading the page. What if I lose my book? I'll have nothing to say. And so I started. And I also understood some poems are easier to memorize, and I started thinking, well, what's wrong with this poem of mine that I can't remember it? And so I like it, and I like it that a lot of people who do that also understand that there are certain things you could do on a page. The language can be thicker, it can be more ambiguous, and everything that you probably can't do just out in the air, and vice versa. That's the way I feel about it. Here's a poem, here's a rhyming poem. And I've never written this poem down. Maybe this is a better response. I haven't written it, I'm not gonna write it down. So it's really for children. I don't see any children here, so I'm just gonna assume that you still have some children locked inside you. So I'll read this poem to that child, which I think is one of the jobs of art, is to keep something open and vulnerable and childlike and creative alive inside us. This called for a child in the audience. And I just want to so you won't ask for your money back, it rhymes. So you can say, yes, and he did read a poem, or say a poem that rhymes. And for a child in the audience, I'm going to have to pick out someone I'm going to refer to as a child. I remember when I was about your size, actually you're taller than I am. I remember when I was about your size, I thought time was forever and grown-ups were wise. I believed wind in the leaves of the cottonwood trees was whispering something, maybe singing to me. I stood late in the yard listening hard, but the leaves would fall or my mother would call. In bed, when I closed my eyes on the day, I imagined more than I knew how to say. I wondered if there was someone like me in some other world or some galaxy shaped like a rose or a disc or a flame, if he looked like me or had a similar name, if she loved and feared the same things I do. And the longer I wondered, the older I grew. I'm telling you this. I'm not sure why. But if you ever meet her, tell her I tried to live what the wind requested of me as it sang down the leaves of that cottonwood tree. Well, I think that's it. So the children are released. You can go. If you have some questions or want to talk, I'd be happy to hang around for a long time and answer. But it's good to be back here. I guess being poet laureate of a state that I'd never entered until I was 35 years old is a really odd thing. But I do think living here prepared me for that, because to grow up in a trailer on the old Cairo Road when my grandfather still plowed the field back there with a mule, and be poet laureate of a state when I didn't even have a book of poetry, it seems to me like it's my mission to encourage people who don't think of themselves as properly literary or maybe even, worthy of writing poetry, to enter that world to some extent. Whether you do it as a career, whether you do it for your own private needs, whether you do it for family, whether you just want to put down something during the brief time we have on earth to stand for who you are and what you felt like, it's a worthwhile thing. We are bombarded every single day with more images, more word, more sales pitch, more buy now, newer and better, more propaganda, more false, trivial, disposable words than we can ever absorb. And once in a while, it's good for anyone to maybe try to put down something a little more accurately to depict who they are, what they felt. You can live your whole life beside someone, with someone, next to someone who doesn't know an important part of you. And because you're reluctant, it makes you vulnerable, or you think that it will cause conflict. And it's not that we want to spill our guts every time we say hello to someone, but once in a while, who we really are in our deepest selves, the way we really feel when we're being honest and truthful about the mystery of being alive, briefly, you need to take a shot at saying it and leaving it behind. Everybody, I've never met a person who hasn't had things that they wish they could say, that things that even those closest to them they have not revealed to. The distance between who you know yourselves to be, what you really think and feel, and what you actually generally tell people, that's poetry, that distance. You never completely traverse that distance. But the better the poem, the closer you come, briefly, from saying that. And when you do say it, and when a poem is successful, what the other person is supposed to think is, yeah, I think that's it. I know what that person means. That's the way I feel. I'm not alone. I'm not the only person in the history of the world who ever felt this strange or this alone or suffered this much or felt this exhilarated. And art is a way that we briefly, but importantly, open that knowledge to each other. It's been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and as we're bombarded by more trivial, disposable language, to me it becomes even important to sometimes take a crack at putting things down in a more lasting and deeper and compassionate language. So now I'm really done. Thank you.